These horrific scenes shocked the whole world.
Long series of brutal attacks upon an unprepared neighbor continued. Japan seized a whole new empire, set up puppet rulers.
In September 1931, Japan began its military campaign against China. This followed what became known as the Mukden Incident, a fabricated explosion on a railway line used as a pretext to invade Manchuria, a region in northeastern China. The Japanese forces rapidly seized the entire region and established a puppet state called Manchuria.
Following border skirmishes such as the Wall Incident in 1934, similar scenes would unfold.
Mussolini was ready. Italy at the time had the foremost air force in Europe. Emperor Haile Selassie rallied his tribesmen, armed only with spears and ancient rifles, to oppose tanks, guns, trained armies, and planes. The slaughter continued.
In October 1935, Italian forces invaded Abyssinia. Fascist Italy would conclude this campaign in May 1936. Due to the significant technological advantage of the Italians, the Ethiopians were unable to resist the push.
Although these conflicts took place in different areas of the world, with different participants and ideological backgrounds, there was something that linked these campaigns.
They distinctly showed that the mechanism of collective security that existed at the time was collapsing. This was a major political blow to the organization created to ensure the functionality of such a mechanism, the League of Nations. The League of Nations was established in 1919, following the end of the First World War. It was designed to prevent future conflicts through a principle called collective security.
The idea was straightforward. If one member nation was attacked, all members would treat it as an attack on themselves, something similar to what Article 5 of NATO envisages today.
President Woodrow Wilson championed this approach. He believed it would create what he called a community of power based on international public opinion rather than military might. However, despite Wilson being its chief architect, the United States ultimately never joined the League.
The context matters here. The First World War had killed approximately 10 million soldiers and devastated the whole Europe. There was a genuine desire among populations and leaders to find a new way to manage international disputes.
In this context, there are two key articles that are worth our attention. Article 16 stated that if any member resorted to war in violation of the covenant, it would in principle be treated as an act of war against all other members. Article 10 asked members to preserve each other's territorial integrity and political independence against external aggression.
However, there was immediate disagreement about implementation.
European leaders like France's Georges Clemenceau and Britain's David Lloyd George had different priorities than Wilson. Having just experienced the war directly, they wanted concrete military guarantees and definable borders. The compromise that emerged was this. Article 10 stated that the League's Council would advise upon the means by which territorial integrity would be preserved. This meant the League could recommend action, but it couldn't compel member states to act. The decision to deploy military forces remained with individual national parliaments. Without the United States, the League lacked substantial economic and military leverage from its inception. The organization would depend primarily on Britain and France for enforcement capability.
The occasion to test such capabilities would arise after Japan began its Manchurian expansion.
On September 21st, China immediately appealed to both the League of Nations and the United States for assistance. The League's initial response was to issue a summons calling for Japan to withdraw its troops by mid-November 1931. When this deadline passed, and Japan ignored the demand, the League found itself without effective options.
In Washington, Henry L. Stimson, then Secretary of State, now Secretary of War, sent out a blistering denunciation of the attack. The League of Nations sent a committee of 5, headed by Lord Lytton and including our own General Frank McCoy, to Manchuria to investigate.
In December 1931, the League appointed the Lytton Commission to conduct an on-the-spot inquiry. This marked the first time the League had ever sent a commission to investigate the actions of a great power. Months later, the Lytton Commission produced a unanimous report with clear findings.
We found that the Japanese occupation of this large part of China was not justified on the ground of self-defense, and that the new state which had been set up was a Japanese protectorate rather than a genuine case of Manchurian self-determination.
To resolve the crisis, the Commission recommended a Japanese troop withdrawal and proposed creating a largely autonomous Manchurian administration that would remain under Chinese sovereignty whilst safeguarding Japanese economic interests.
Despite these findings, the League lacked both the determination and the physical enforcement mechanisms to protect China or to implement its own proposals.
The most severe action the League managed to take was a February 1933 declaration recommending the member states refuse to officially recognize the puppet state of Manchuria. No meaningful collective sanctions were ever imposed upon Japan by the League. In response to the League's criticism, Japanese delegate Matsuoka Yosuke delivered an intemperate speech likening Japan's international condemnation to a crucifixion.
It is a matter of common knowledge that Japan's policy is fundamentally inspired by a genuine desire to guarantee peace in the Far East and to contribute to the maintenance of peace throughout the world. Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
Japan formally withdrew from the League in March 1933.
The Manchurian Crisis completely exposed the League's impotence. It demonstrated to the world. It likely factored into the calculations of observing expansionist leaders like Benito Mussolini that the League possessed no real moral or physical authority and could not be relied upon to protect any state from an unprovoked attack.
When Italian forces invaded Abyssinia in October 1935, the League of Nations Assembly voted 50-1 to impose collective measures and sanctions against Italy. This appeared to be a strong response. However, guided largely by Britain and France, the League's committee charged with devising these sanctions actively avoided any measures that might provoke a wider war. The resulting sanctions were entirely half-hearted and ineffective.
Members of the League half-heartedly stopped trading with Italy, but refused the only thing that will stop any aggressor: force.
The League prohibited the export of certain commodities to Italy, such as aluminium, which Italy already produced in surplus, and scrap iron, which the Italian metallurgical industry rarely used. More critically, the League refused to embargo oil, strictly necessary to maintain the Italian military campaign. This decision was made out of fear that halting oil shipments would mean war. Pig iron and steel billets were also allowed to flow into Italy without hindrance.
The League ultimately avoided sanctions that might seriously hinder Italy or provoke escalation. The sanctions proved completely incapable of deterring Italian aggression and only served to stimulate Italy's war spirit.
Behind the scenes, Britain and France had secretly attempted to appease Mussolini. In late 1935, they drafted the Hoare-Laval Plan, which proposed offering Ethiopia to Italy in phases. When this plan became public, the resulting outrage forced both governments to abandon the deal and maintain the League's hollow sanctions.
This diplomatic failure had significant consequences. It alienated Mussolini from the Western democracies, driving him to turn to Nazi Germany for the oil and coal his economy needed. Hitler's support for the Ethiopian adventure marked a critical turning point in their relationship, destroying the League's credibility and initiating a process of alignment that would lead to the Rome-Berlin Axis in 1936 and eventually the formal Pact of Steel in 1939.
By July 1936, the sanctions were lifted. Italy had successfully conquered Abyssinia, and the League had again demonstrated that it would not enforce collective security when doing so conflicted with major powers' interests. For smaller nations, the lessons were particularly stark. The League had failed to protect China, a founding member, from Japanese aggression. It had then failed to protect Abyssinia, also a League member, from Italian conquest.
Article 10's promise of territorial integrity had been tested twice and found worthless. Smaller states realized this guarantee was not reliable against determined aggression from major powers. Countries began making their own arrangements for security. Some sought alliances with major powers. Others attempted to remain neutral. The principle of collective security had been thoroughly discredited.
By the time Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, starting the Second World War, the League of Nations was no longer functioning as intended. It played no meaningful role in responding to the crisis and had become politically irrelevant for major security issues.
The road from Manchuria in 1931 to Poland in 1939 demonstrated how the League's repeated failures to enforce collective security encouraged further aggression. Each successful violation made the next one more likely. Looking at the League's structure, several factors contributed to this failure.
First, it had no standing military force. Enforcement depended entirely on member states volunteering their own troops and resources. When major powers were unwilling to do so, the League had no independent capability to act. Second, the League could only advise, not command. Article 10's language meant that recommendations for action were not binding. Individual parliaments made the final decisions about military deployment. Third, the absence of the United States removed significant economic and diplomatic leverage. The League lacked the participation of the world's largest economy and an emerging military power. Fourth, Britain and France, the League's strongest members, prioritized their own national interests when these conflicted with collective security obligations. During the economic crisis of the 1930s, they were unwilling to risk their own stability for distant conflicts. The United Nations, established in 1945, attempted to address some of the League's structural weaknesses. It created the Security Council with 5 permanent members who have veto power, giving it more authority than the League Council had, including stronger enforcement tools like Chapter 7 resolutions. However, certain similarities remain. The UN also lacks a standing army and depends on member states to contribute forces for peacekeeping operations. When major powers' interests conflict with collective action, the Security Council veto can prevent intervention.
The fundamental challenge persists. International organizations require sovereign nations to sometimes prioritize collective interests over national ones, but these organizations lack independent enforcement mechanisms. What do you think about all this? Please let me know in the comments below. Thank you and take care.